By the spring of 1934, the Panhandle had forgotten what green looked like. The grass had worn down to the nub, the mesquite claws reached for any hint of sky. Even the windmills sounded tired when their blades caught a fitful breeze and squealed. Folks in Armstrong County had a saying that year: you could pour a bucket of daylight on the ground and the dust would drink it, and people laughed at it because it hurt too much not to. The feud between the Suttons and the Caldwells was older than the windmill at Section 9, older than the cottonwoods along the creek that hadn't seen water since Hoover took office. It started back in 22 when somebody moved a corner post, or swore somebody else had. The men carried it like a second name. Every nick in the barbed wire and every hoofprint near the tank meant suspicion. Every stray calf cut back across the line meant a hard jaw and a fresh entry in the ledger of things not forgiven. Jonah Hayes had no taste for keeping ledgers of hurt. He worked for Caleb Sutton because a man had to keep a roof over his head, and because he could keep a string of horses honest, which not every cowhand could. He was 38, with hands like a carpenter's, and a way of listening that made folks tell him more than they meant to. He was a widow's son himself, raised on quiet and work. The world had made him careful, and the country had made him spare with words. That afternoon, the sky did its trick where it turned from bone to bruise in 10 minutes flat. Jonah looked up from the kink he was fixing in the south fence and saw the horizon thicken. He'd seen dust storms roll and split and dance. He knew this one wasn't dancing. It had a straight back and a front edge sharp as a plow blade. He whistled for his gelding whiskey and cinched tight. He could make the windmill at 9 if he put his head down and didn't think about anything else. Half a mile out, the wind arrived, like someone had shoved the whole Panhandle forward at once. The first breath brought dirt that tasted burned, like something old had been cooked down to bitterness. Jonah pulled his bandana up and turned Whiskey's rump to the north, letting the horse pick the trail by memory. When the black of the front hit, it hit like a house falling. The air had weight, and sound shrank to the creak of leather and the hiss of grit along the ground. He would have made 9 just the same if he hadn't heard it, that high, wrong cry that isn't calf or coyote, a child's voice thinned out by fear. Jonah stopped without thinking. Whiskey planted his feet and tucked his chin. He didn't like stopping when the sky ate the day, but he liked Jonah's hands on his neck, and he trusted those hands. The cry came again, from the Sutton-Caldwell fence line, from a strip of drawers where a hard wind could hide anything. Jonah tried not to measure the trouble. Sutton land this side, Caldwell land on the other, and a black blizzard laid like a blanket over the border that kept grown men from tipping their hats. He slid off, tied the reins short, and crouched low. He counted steps because sight was good for 5 yards and no more. 10 steps, 15. He walked until the fence pawed at his shoulder and his fingers found rust and wire. The third cry was right under his chin, so close it made him jump. He dropped to his knees and felt along the ground. His hand hit cloth, then a boot, then a shin, skinny as a lamp leg. "It's all right," he said, or tried to. The bandana made his voice small. He pulled it down. "It's all right? You hurt?" The figure on the ground coughed so hard it sounded like tearing. He put his body between the wind and that coughing, and the grit stung the back of his neck like fists. The child, no more than 12, had a coat buttoned wrong and a scarf knotted like someone had tied it with hands shaking. The hair under the cap was dark and stuck to a sweating forehead. The left hand was wrapped in barbed wire where panic had led it to grab and hold. "I can't, Mama," the child tried. "Save your breath," Jonah said softly. He took his pocket knife, slipped the blade under the wire loop, and cut careful, then careful again. He worked the barbs free from skin without snagging, the way he'd once learned to lay down a foal from a fence mess. The little hand bled under dirt, but it was a good kind of bleeding, the kind that meant life had something to say about it. "I'm going to pick you up," he said. "If you can stand, we can walk. If you can't, I'll carry." The child tried to stand and buckled. Jonah didn't ask again. He scooped the little weight up against his chest, turning his back to the wind. He took 3 steps and his boot caught a rock and he went to one knee. The child cried out once and then bit it off hard. Jonah grunted, found his feet and pushed against air that wanted him down. He reached the fence where he'd come in and slapped along the posts until he found the gap he knew. 2 staples missing, wire bowing. He shouldered through, felt the barb kiss his shoulder through denim, and counted steps until Whiskey's breath hit the side of his face, warm as bread. He threw the child up into the saddle and swung up behind like he had when he was green and thought horses owed him favors. "Hang on," he said into the child's ear, and he felt thin arms go hard around his waist. It was slower going back than coming. The wind had learned his weight and pushed accordingly, smart as a mule. He thought of 9 and the tank and the bunkhouse with its stove that could turn damp air into something thick enough to breathe. He fixed in his mind the board that stuck on the bunkhouse door and how you had to lift it when you pulled, and he rode to that memory the way a sailor rides to a light he can't yet see. 9's windmill showed itself not by sight, but by sound, that old squeal singing through the dust like a blind fiddle. He found the windward side of the pump tower and tied Whiskey there to give the horse something taller than the dark to stand with. He carried the child inside the bunkhouse and kicked the door shut behind him. The air went from black to grey. Grey was something you could think in. He laid the child on his bunk and lit a match with his thumbnail. The flame shook in the draught, then steadied. By matchlight he saw the face. A girl. Eyes too big for a face gone thin with the winter, grit tracked with tears. She blinked at the flame, like it might be fragile. "You're Caldwell," Jonah said, and the girl flinched like he'd thrown something. He softened his tone. "I ain't going to harm you. I'm going to wash that hand. What's your name?" "May," she whispered. "May Caldwell." "All right, May. I'm Jonah. I'm going to get water hot, and I'm going to wash what the wire did. Then you're going to drink. Then you're going to tell me why you were out in that." "Calves," she said. "We were pushing them to the draw. Papa said the fence would break if we didn't. Then the wind came. The mare spooked. Her eyes went glassy again and rolled a little." Jonah took a kettle, poured from the barrel he kept in the corner, the one he guarded like a prayer, and set it to the stove, coaxing flame steady with a twist of paper and a patient hand. When the water steamed, he cleaned that little hand with slow, sure motions, not talking, not looking away, when blood showed and May's breath hitched. He bound the cuts with a strip he tore from one of his own shirts when the clean bandages in the tin ran short. He made coffee for himself and watered it down for her, a finger of it in a mug filled with hot water and 1 spoon of sugar, because he had 2 left and she needed 1 more than he did. "You're Sutton," she said finally, the word like a dare and a question together. "I work for Sutton," he said. "I belong to my mother and to my horses. How many of you were out pushing calves?" "4," she said, and the tears he'd kept at bay with the business of hands came now, fat and embarrassed. "Papa and my uncles and me. I fell behind. I thought if I cut across the fence—" "Fence don't know your name," Jonah said. "Don't care about your papa or mine." He looked through the little window where the dust made a fog that seemed to stick to the glass itself. "Phone's down," he added. It was a guess, but a good one. "Lines snap in this." He thought about saddling back up and riding south to town, about the darkness between here and there, and the way a horse could decide it had had enough. He thought about Caleb Sutton's temper, and the way Caleb had spoken last week of the Caldwells, as if they were coyotes, not people. "You starve a coyote and you solve a problem," Caleb had said, and some of the men had laughed in the way men laugh when they don't want to be seen agreeing. "Where's your mother, May?" Jonah asked. "At the house," she said, "with Eli, my little brother. He coughs." She coughed herself as if to prove they were kin. "She'll be scared." "She will." He poured the last of the hot water into the kettle and topped the barrel with a tarp. He breathed once, deep, and let out the air slowly, the way he'd learned to when horses thought the whole world was a snake. "I can wait this front out and ride you home at dark, but the cattle will break a fence if nobody talks to them before then, and your hand needs a woman's care." May looked at him like boys look at railroad timetables, trying to make sense of something that always runs late. "Why would you help us?" she asked. There was no child in the way she asked it. It was the voice of a Caldwell who knew a Sutton had no business crossing a line for a good reason or a bad. "Because I heard you," Jonah said simply. "Because a fence ain't a reason to let a child choke to death in the dirt." He didn't add the thing that sat in his chest like an extra rib, that 10 years ago a woman had died in a storm because someone took too long to cross a line, and that he had been the someone. That was his ledger. He didn't hand it out. The door banged in the wind. He tied a kerchief around his own mouth and nose, and another around May's, newer cloth for her. He wrapped a blanket tight and lifted her again. Whiskey sidled but held. The dust had changed. It wasn't the wall anymore, but a world of pebbled air and sound like paper tearing miles wide. He found the notch in the east fence and let Whiskey find his way down the draw where the sand packed tighter, and the scrub offered a little cover. When the Caldwell gate loomed out of the dirt, it felt like a church crouched in a storm, stubborn and small. Jonah eased Whiskey to a stop and slid down with May in his arms. The shapes came out of the dark like men poured from a mold, broad hats, bandanas, rifles held down but not away. The first one to speak was a woman. "May!" she called, and when the girl said, "Mama," the dust lifted for a heartbeat and eyes met. Same dark eyes, the mother's with bare rock behind them. "Alma Caldwell," Jonah said, so there'd be no mistake. He put May on her feet, and she ran the last 5 steps, stumbling fast, and the woman folded her up like you fold a letter you mean to keep. 2 men stood with Alma. Walt Caldwell, the older brother with a scar down the jawline, and a cousin whose name Jonah never remembered, a boy who tried too hard with his shoulders. Walt picked the rifle up a hair. "Hayes," he said, and the syllable had dust in it. "You brought her." "I did," Jonah said. He kept his hands away from his belt. "She was hung up in wire on Sutton land. The storm was doing its worst. And you crossed," Walt said. "Not a question. I crossed." Jonah could feel Sutton eyes from behind him. Even if they weren't truly there, they sat on his back like pairs of hands. There was always someone watching when you didn't want them, and never someone when you did. "There's more," he added, "because there was always more, and you either said it or you let it rot between people. Your calves are pushing the north line. Caleb will run them if he finds them, drive them hard and not count ears. He's angry, and he's wrong with it. I can open 9's tank. I can water a string and hold them till you can fetch. I'll set bodies at the breaks and mend enough for the night. Then I'll go home and take my scolding like a man who knows what he did." Alma's jaw worked once. "Why?" she asked, and her voice wasn't grateful. It was thin with the same thing that had thinned the girls, fear and something older, debt and the hunger not to owe a thing. "Because she's a child," Jonah said, nodding at May's head under Alma's hand. "Because cattle die for men's pride, and that ain't right in a year when everything dies that can't help it. Because I got to sleep with myself, and I'd like to sleep tonight." Walt looked at Alma. She didn't nod. She didn't have to. The sort of nod she gave lived in how the rifle stayed pointed at the ground, and how she moved a half step so Jonah could see the yard, see the pump, the wash line snapping hard as reins, the little boy on the porch with a blanket over his shoulders and eyes like a hawk's. "All right," Walt said. "If you open 9, we'll move the calves through. We won't forget it. We also won't be in your debt on paper." He reached into his coat and pulled a folded oilskin packet. He held it out. "You've worked fences along the east draw this year. You've seen where the land slumps after a storm and the posts lean. There's a survey from '06 says the line is 5 rods west from where Sutton set his new wire last fall. You want to carry something that ain't a gun back to your boss? Carry this." Jonah didn't take it. "That's a fight for men with chairs and maps," he said, and Alma's mouth twitched the smallest bit. "I'll take May's thanks and Eli's cough to heart. You hold your side tonight, and you send a hand at dawn to 9. We'll water both brands as they come, and nobody will count wrong. We'll argue about everything else when we can see our fingers again." Alma lifted her chin. "We can agree to live through the night," she said. "That's a treaty I can sign in dust." Jonah tipped his hat, which was as good as a signature. He turned and swung up, and for a breath the dust at the gate parted enough that he could see beyond it, the red horse barn, the cedar post. Alma leaned on when the sky was clean, the swing made from a tire where a child should have been swinging instead of biting down on cloth to keep from crying. Back at 9, he opened the valve on the tank and listened to the slow blessing of water in a hungry year. He sent a roper north to cut the calves into the strip that held instead of the one that ran. He strung a lantern on the west post, the light a man could ride to if he didn't care what name the man holding the lantern answered to. When the first Caldwell calves pushed their noses into the tank, Jonah put his hand on a pole and felt bone and hide make a vow. He figured he'd pay for it. He also figured there hadn't been a better bargain struck on either side of that fence since the first post went in the ground. The wind dropped at midnight like a curtain after a children's play. The stars came back mean and cold. By dawn, the dust lay in thin drifts like a brown snowfall, and a hawk with ragged feathers took a breath like he'd just surfaced from deep. Caleb Sutton rode in with 2 hands, just as the Caldwell riders eased a last string through the gap. Caleb took in the tank, the calves, the lantern burned down to a thumb of soot. His jaw worked, his eyes cut to Jonah and then to the Caldwell gate where Alma stood straight as a fence post on stone. He turned his horse so his voice would carry. "You watered their cattle," he said. "I watered cattle," Jonah answered. "There's no theirs and ours when their lungs are turning to grit. There's just cattle that live and cattle that don't." Caleb's nostrils flared. "You crossed," he said, and it was the same word Walt had used, with different weather packed into it. "I crossed," Jonah said, and looked at Alma as he said it, so no one could make a story of what he was willing to admit. "And I brought a child home. And I'll tell you this, Caleb, if you start a count of favors and debts this morning, you'll lose more than a fence. Men will start counting with you, and they'll remember what you forget. Best thing is to call it a night's work and set your jaw for the next one." Caleb looked at the men on either side of him. They weren't laughing. Men get tired of swallowing dust. Some of that dust settles in the spot where laughter used to be. He spat once, the way a man does when he can't find other use for his mouth, and wheeled his horse. "We'll talk," he said, which was about as much as a Sutton ever did when a Caldwell was watching. When they were gone, Alma didn't wave. She just lifted a hand to the brim of her hat, a salute done with 2 fingers and no smile. Jonah lifted his hat in return and let his hand fall slow. What had happened that night was small to tell and big to carry. It was only water given and a child born from one side to the other, but in a country where men had died for less, it opened a gate that had been shut with more than wire. As the sun took hold and the dust began to settle in seams and corners, Jonah leaned a shoulder against the post at 9 and watched the windmill turn steady for the first time in a month. He didn't know it yet, but before summer was out, that little act would reach farther than cattle and farther than pride, into papers and into kitchens, into the place where women keep their lists and men keep their grudges. For now, he breathed a clean breath and let the morning rub his lungs. Somewhere across the line, a child named Eli coughed less. Somewhere in town, a survey lay under a judge's hand. And somewhere in Jonah, a 10-year-old guilt found a place to sit that didn't hurt. The country had a long memory, but that day it found room for a new kind of remembering, the sort that starts with a man saying, "I heard a child, so I crossed," and ends with folks who'd learned not to look at one another, learning how again. Folks think feuds end with a shot or a handshake. Most of the time they end with coffee. You can't put that in a newspaper, but if you've lived long enough in a hard county, you know the smell of boiled grounds has more to do with peace than words do. 6 mornings after the black blizzard, Jonah rode up to the Caldwell place with an empty saddlebag and a full notion that if he didn't get ahead of what men were making of that night, The wind would do it for him. The gate was open, no small thing, and a boy came out leading a little sorrel pony that hadn't been tied the night before. The boy's blanket was gone, his chest rose free. He looked at Jonah with interest, not challenge. "You, Eli?" Jonah asked. "Yes, sir," the boy said. His voice had the edge of somebody who'd been sick and had decided not to be anymore. "Mama says you brought my sister out of Witchwind." "Your mama's poetry's not bad," Jonah said. "I only did what I could do." Alma stood on the porch with her arms folded, the sun putting a halo on the dust still collected on the porch rail. She didn't ask him to come in. She didn't tell him to stay out. She let him choose, which in a house like that is how you set the table without moving a plate. He climbed the steps and took his hat off. He stayed on his feet until she sat. When she did, he did. The little rules matter most when the big ones are in play. "I brought nothing," he said, opening his hands over the table, "and I mean to take nothing. I came to say two things. First, you owe me nothing that needs righting. Second, there's a way to keep cattle watered and men's names out of the sheriff's mouth until this drought decides to give us back some kindness." Alma poured coffee without asking him if he'd take it. He took it without asking if it was for him. She boiled hers strong, the way women do when they know the day needs something to push against. "Say the way," she said. "Nine's windmill pulls clean," Jonah said. "It's Sutton land, but Caleb's stingy about fences, not water. He's a proud fool, but he ain't cruel by design. If we set times, your cattle at dawn and ours at noon, with a man from both places counting heads and noting brands, we can keep hands from jawing and horses from stamping wire. We agree not to push calves underweight. We agree to cut strays back without a tally of sin. And we agree that when the wind goes quiet, the wire goes up honest where the survey says, not where anyone's temper puts it." Alma's eyes didn't move from his face. "You carry a survey in your pocket now?" "No," Jonah said, and he smiled a small smile that said he had learned a thing and didn't mind it. "But I carry a notion what it would mean if the one from 1906 turned out to be right. It would mean a good piece of fence wrong, and a good number of men wrong with it. It would mean the words I was wrong would need to get said by somebody whose tongue ain't used to it." Alma blew across the rim of her cup. "Caleb Sutton's tongue hasn't made that shape since his baptism," she said. The corner of her mouth twitched, same as at the gate, and then lay flat again. "You have any rights to speak for him?" "None," Jonah said, "but I have some weight to make him listen. He cares for what other men think of him, however he pretends otherwise. He knows I saved his cattle face that night as much as yours. He knows if he fires me, he fires the man who held 9 when his own boys rode for the bunkhouse to wait it out. He knows the hands watched, and that matters as much as the law some days. He'll be angry if I speak plain, and he'll be angrier if I don't." Alma set her cup down. "You talk like a preacher, and a farrier had a son," she said. "Fine. You make your visit, I'll make mine." "Your visit?" "To the judge," she said. "Walt carried that oilskin his granddaddy kept under floorboard. Don't look at me like I'm foolish. Every family in this county has a floorboard, and it's got a survey under an old county seal. I'll let a man with a stamp and a stale shirt look at it. If he says it's smoke, I'll throw it in the stove myself. If he says it stands, I'll invite you and your boss to watch me set a line where it lives. Then you can see what it looks like to be wrong and keep your hat on." Jonah sipped his coffee and decided he would like this woman, even if she never liked him. "Deal," he said. They shook hands over the table, which in some houses would have been a scandal, and in this one was a sacrament. Eli watched with wide eyes and a slowly curving grin that tightened Jonah's throat for no good reason he could name. When Jonah left, he went straight to the Sutton house. It was a bigger place than the Caldwells, with new shingles and a porch that faced the road, because Caleb liked to be seen sitting. Caleb was sitting when Jonah walked up, boots on the rail, hat pushed back to say he had nothing to hide. "You're making your rounds like a politician," Caleb said. He didn't offer coffee. He offered a chair with his boot, which scraped it across the boards like a stubborn mule. There's a thing to be said, Jonah answered, taking the chair and not sitting back in it. Two things, really. Say one then, Caleb said, and swung one leg off the rail. Make it my favorite type. A thing I can agree to without losing my temper. First thing, Jonah said. Water. We set times at 9, Caldwell's at dawn, Sutton's at noon, 2 men counting, brands noted, strays cut back without accusation. You'll still sleep like a Sutton. You just won't wake in the night thinking about dead calves. Caleb's mouth tightened, then relaxed. He wanted to argue because he'd been born with a tongue like a spur. He also wanted to stop waking to the sound of animals dying in his head. Fine, he said. What's the second thing? I feel an itch. Jonah looked him in the eye. Your east fence is wrong, he said. 5 rods wrong, if the paper holds. Alma Caldwell's got a survey. She's going to the judge. If the judge says her paper's a true one, you're going to move your wire. You're going to say you were wrong, and then you're going to shut up about it. You're not going to spit near their line or send boys to cut at night. You're going to fix posts and buy staples and say sir to a man you hate and ma'am to a woman whose eyes could turn you to salt. That's what you're going to do. Caleb didn't move for a long minute. Anger climbed up his neck like heat. You forget yourself, he said softly. I'm remembering myself, Jonah answered. I'm remembering a woman I didn't get to in time because of a line and a mouth. I'm remembering a child whose hand I cleaned because she grabbed at wire when she was scared. I'm remembering a county that's going to blow itself to death if men don't stop feeding the wind their pride. Caleb stood so fast the chair went over. Then, to Jonah's surprise, he picked it up again and set it right. It was the smallest act of grace and the largest he had. If the judge says so, he said finally, each word a stone, I'll move it. I won't like it. I won't clap about it. I'll move it. That's all anybody's asking, Jonah said. The judge was a square man who wore his belts like he was afraid of an updraft. He had a blotter he loved and a stamp he loved more. He looked at the oilskin and the survey and the seals like they were old friends who had come back with stories. He sent a boy to the records room and a man to a drawer. He compared hand to hand and line to line. He pursed his lips. It stands, he said finally. I'll issue a notice. You'll abide by it. The notice went up on the courthouse door, and then it went into the mouth of every woman at the feed store and every man at the barber, and then it went into every pot of beans and every stack of cards. The next Thursday, under a sky the color of a battered kettle, the Caldwells and the Suttons walked the line with 2 judges of a different sort. Old men who remembered where the cottonwoods used to stand before lightning made toothpicks of them. They set a cornerstone under both men's eyes, and they stretched new wire between posts that got sunk without spitting. Caleb came with a crew and a purse. Alma came with Walt and a hammer she used herself. Jonah came with staples and a lunch pail. They worked without music. The sound of wire singing when you pull it true has its own hymn. Halfway through, a boy from the Caldwell side came running with a cigar box. "Mama!" he yelled. "Mama! The book!" He held it like it held a heart. Alma opened it and pulled out a small cloth-bound ledger with debits and credits in a hand, so tight it looked like it hurt. On every page were marks, 1 for a calf strayed and not returned, 3 for a cut fence, 10 for a thrown punch, 20 for a night in lockup. It went back to 22, and each mark had a name beside it, and every name had a face that had aged in kitchens and fields while the little lines multiplied. Alma looked at it, at the old anger laid plain, and then looked at the men bent over the wire. She turned and walked to the burn barrel set for the old staples and the rotten fence that couldn't hold a promise anymore. She set the ledger in the barrel and struck a match. She watched until the first page browned and curled, and the marks lifted to the sky as black pollen. Walt grabbed her wrist. "You sure?" he asked, but his voice made it a token, not a protest. "I'm tired," she said. "I don't want to carry books that don't buy bread. We'll keep the survey. we'll burn the grudge." Jonah watched the smoke go up and thought of all the little fires men start so they don't have to carry paper. This one warmed, not burned. He felt something in his chest loosen and wondered if that was what folks meant when they said a man's heart had room. Caleb stood with his jaw set and his eyes looking anywhere but at the barrel. When Alma turned to him, he didn't flinch. "Judge says," he said. "Judge says," she echoed. He nodded once. It was not, "I'm sorry." It was not, "Thank you." But it was the only word his tongue had oil for that day. He took off his gloves and pushed a post true, and his hands bled in the spots where the skin had gone soft from not doing that particular hurt lately. He did not hide it. By evening, the line was set. The men shook hands because papers like that like to be signed twice, once in ink and once in skin. Alma brought coffee out in enamel mugs that clinked when you knocked them to a nail-head. Caleb took one and said "Ma'am" without sarcasm. Eli, in a sweater that made him look like a lamb in people's clothes, stood near Jonah and asked 100 questions about horses. May kept her bandaged hand behind her back as if embarrassment could make a wound smaller. Alma reached and brought it forward and kissed it, and the girl went pink and tall at once. "Coffee's strong," Caleb said. He had a way of making the plainest sentence sound like a term sheet. "It's work coffee," Alma said. "Not visiting coffee. I suppose I'm working," he said. His eyes slid to Jonah for a heartbeat, and in that flicker was something like humor. It wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing. Over the weeks that followed, the schedule at 9 made a rhythm that steadied more than calves. At dawn, the Caldwell riders came in quiet, counted, watered, cut strays without a scrap. At noon, the Sutton hands did the same. On Sundays, nobody came. The windmill spun anyway, and the tank threw a skin the thickness of a fingernail by morning that a hand broke without thinking. The men started to nod before they looked away. The women started to wave if the road was empty. If a fence went slack, a boy from either side tightened it without a lecture. The county looked smaller and kinder by inches, the way a man looks kinder when he is asleep. There were backslidings. One afternoon, a Sutton kid with too much Saturday in his blood put spurs to a Caldwell steer and whooped like a fool. Walt eased his mare over and touched his brim in a way that wasn't full of sweetness, and the boy went red and said "sir" and won himself the right to grow up. Another day, a Caldwell cousin drank corn out of a jar at noon and came riding in sideways with his talk loud. Alma came out and picked him off the saddle with one hand on his ear and the other on his belt, and the men looked away and smiled into their coffee because a woman's justice is the cleanest tool. In July, the rain came in a way that didn't mock. It fell thin and steady for a week, then fat and quick in an evening that made the dust take a breath and give off a smell like pennies and garden dirt together. Little green showed up like a rumor along the north fence, then like a truth. The wind still had its habits, but the edge of it dulled. The hawk looked less ragged. Cows went to shade not because they were exhausted, but because they could. When the county fair came at summer's end, Alma brought pies and won a ribbon because a Caldwell crust had a way with lard. Caleb brought a steer that had no business being that polished in such a year and took second behind a boy from down by Claude who had the sort of luck that visits once in a decade and leaves footprints. Alma and Caleb stood near the notice board at the same time and did not move away. Jonah saw it and had to turn and watch the Ferris wheel because he felt like a man who had stumbled on a chapel where two old saints had taken off their armor and were looking at their own skin. It didn't all turn into gospel. People are people. Walt got into a shouting match with a Sutton cousin over a hand that had quit one place and hired onto the other, and the way a man takes his knowledge with him like a pair of boots. Voices rose. Boots scuffed. Then Eli coughed so hard he had to sit, and both men stopped because a child's body will embarrass a fight if you let it. They lifted the boy between them like a log, and the shouting went out of the day like a wind that finds a canyon and decides to sleep in it. Sometime in that same stretch of days, Caleb sent for Jonah. He didn't sit on the porch. He met him out by the corral, where the smell is a little less polite, and the truth doesn't echo. "You cost me face," he said without heat. "I know," Jonah said. "You kept me from losing more than that," Caleb added. He looked at Jonah's hands, which had cuts across the knuckles from fencing the day the judge stood by, and at the ridge along Jonah's shoulder where the barbed wire had kissed through denim when he had shouldered through the gap with a child in his arms. "I don't pay extra for decency," he said. "It's supposed to be part of the work." "It is," Jonah said. "But I'll say this where a man can hear me." Caleb put a hand on the top rail and pressed like he was testing the fence he was talking to. "You did right. I ain't learned to like being wrong, and I don't practice it, but you were right, and I don't aim to punish that. It wasn't a thank you. It wasn't a feast. It was what Jonah needed to keep working without having to swallow his own tongue. Sometimes that's the miracle." Years later, when men told the story of the Caldwell-Sutton feud in Armstrong County, they liked to tell it wrong. That's the way of men who were not there. They said a Sutton shot a Caldwell, and a Caldwell forgave him at the bedside. They said the judge saved the day, or the preacher did, or a grass fire burned through the worst of it like judgment. The women told it plainer when they told it at all. They said, "A man heard a child and crossed the fence." They said, "A woman burned a book and boiled coffee strong." They said, "Men moved a wire where it belonged and nobody died of it." If you went out to 9 after the war, when the boys came back older than their ages and the windmills had the creek taken out of them by grease and time, you could still see the cornerstone under the cottonwood that finally found water again. You could run your fingers over the staple heads smooth from weather and think about the day folks chose to pull a line straight instead of their guns. And if you were lucky enough to be invited to Alma Caldwell's kitchen while the coffee boiled, you might see on the shelf above the stove a little tin box. If you asked what was in it, she'd say, "Nothing, that's the point." It had once held a ledger, and the ledger had once held a county hostage. It was empty as a sky after storm. It was worth more empty than full. As for Jonah, he grew old in the way men do who learn to spend their strength instead of their anger. He kept his listening and his horses. He married a woman who had the gift of saying "eat" in a tone that made a man feel invited to stay alive. He rode fence with Eli when the boy got long in the leg and quick with a grin, and he danced with May in a barn strung with kerosene lamps on the night she wore a dress the color of the first dawn after rain. When he died, because everybody does, men from both sides carried him, and Alma made the coffee for the wake and didn't water it down, and Caleb stood under the cottonwood and took off his hat not like a Sutton, but like a man. The country has a long memory. It remembers storms by the names of the men who failed in them and the ones who didn't. It remembers feuds by the day they start and the day they go quiet. This one didn't end with a headline or a bullet. It ended the way a lot of good things start, with a gate opening, with a child being carried through it, with water shared when water mattered most. If you listen, you can still hear the windmill at 9 turning. It sounds like work. It sounds like mercy. And some days when the air is right and the dust sits polite on the ground, it sounds a little like forgiveness.